Thank you, Judy, for the lovely music. Welcome to today's convocation, to those here in Marwick, and to you participating online. We thank the Resident Executive Council for their continuing support of our weekly convocations, and we appreciate the staff for their valued technical support. We'll begin our convocation with hymn, Spirit, Spirit of Gentleness, number 291 in the Glory to God hymnal. And we'll sing verses 2 and 4. Spirit, Spirit of gentleness, blow through the wilderness, calling and free. Spirit, Spirit of restlessness, stir me from placidness, wind, wind on the sea. You swept through the desert, you stung with the sand, and you goaded your people with a law and a land. When they were confounded with idols and lies, then you spoke through your prophets to open their eyes. Verse 4. You Spirit, Spirit of gentleness, blow through the wilderness, calling and free. Spirit, Spirit of restlessness, stir me from placidness, wind, wind on the sea. You call from tomorrow, you break ancient schemes, from the bondage of sorrow, the captives dream dreams. Our women see visions, our men clear their eyes, with bold new decisions, your people arise. Spirit, Spirit of gentleness, blowing the wilderness, blowing and free. Spirit, Spirit of righteousness, sickness, wind, wind on the sea. Today's scripture reading is from Luke 10:29. When a lawyer asked Jesus, "Who is my neighbor that I should love as myself?" Jesus tells the story of the Samaritan who with compassion stopped on the road to help and provide needed assistance for a man stripped and beaten by thieves. This man, Jesus tells, had been seen earlier by a priest and a Levite, both of whom walked away offering no assistance to the injured man. Jesus asked the lawyer, "Which of these do you think proved neighbor to the man who fell among the thieves?" The lawyer answered, "The one who showed mercy." And Jesus replied, "Go and do likewise." Please pray with me. God of grace and mercy, as we gather as your people, guide us in your ways that we might see our neighbor as ourself, a beloved person of your creation. In our world of many divisions, give us the wisdom to bridge the gaping spaces between us wherever our feet take us. We pray in your holy name. Amen. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Professor Amir Hussain, who is our today's speaker, and Joan Becker, his wife. Amir and Joan met at the First United Methodist Church in North Hollywood, where Joan was a member and sang in the choir, and Amir had been invited to give a Thanksgiving reflection at an interfaith service at the church. Joan and Amir will stay for dinner this evening, so if you're able to join us to continue the conversation, please do. Professor Hussain teaches theological studies at the Jesuit University, Loyola Marymount University, where he's also served as chair of that department. He teaches courses on Islam, the world's second largest religious tradition with 2 billion members worldwide. And he has a primary focus on contemporary Muslim societies in North America. In 2023, Professor Hussain served as president of the American Academy of Religion, the world's largest scholarly organization for the study of religion. He's written and edited 5 books and authored more than 60 scholarly articles and chapters on religion. He is the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam in North America, which will be published next year by Oxford University Press. Professor Hussain was born in Pakistan, moved with his family to Canada at the age of 4, and took all his schooling in Toronto, and now holds dual citizenship in the US and Canada. Professor Hussain's most recent book, which is up here, is titled One God and Two Religions, Christian and Muslims as Neighbors. Amir, I'm pleased to welcome you as my neighbor and to introduce you and Joan to this warm-hearted neighborhood of Monte Vista Grove Homes. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you to Barbara for that kind introduction. Thank you to Judy for the wonderful music. Thank you all for the singing. It's really funny because, as Barbara mentioned, Joan's a Methodist, and that hymn you sang was Jim Manley, one of my favorite Methodist hymn writers. So nice ecumenical kinds of things here. And Barbara mentioned, I did all my work at the University of Toronto, where I was privileged to work with Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was the great Canadian scholar of religion, really in the 20th century, good Presbyterian himself, a Presbyterian minister. And so I was saying to Barbara, I think I first met her and her unfortunately late husband Jim in 2005 when I moved there to LMU, introduced by Jeff Syker, who was then our chair of the department, another Presbyterian minister. And so you've got some interesting connections for me, with the Presbyterian church here. And so as Barbara mentioned, I've got this new book, One God, Two Religions. I want to talk a little bit about that. We actually hadn't planned today as the talk, meaning, of course, the anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. It just sort of turned out that way because originally Barbara had asked me to come, and it was during Ramadan, and I couldn't do it then. And then we were trying to find a time in October, and it's one of those funny moments where I'm going to be in Utah next Thursday to do some work at BYU. I'm in Toronto the following Thursday back home to actually give a talk at the 50th anniversary of our department for the study of religion. And then I'm in Ann Arbor, Michigan the week after to give a talk at the University of Michigan. They have a new institute named after Raoul Wallenberg, who some of you know is the diplomat who sort of rescued Jews. Didn't realize that Wallenberg had come to Michigan to do his law degree. And so it's this fascinating kind of thing there. So, but it's funny because so this is the only Thursday this month that I'm here. So I'm delighted to be here, but cognizant of the fact, you know, we're speaking on the anniversary of 9/11, and we can talk about that during the Q&A. My students tell me that I'm much more interesting if I have pictures behind me, and so I'll have some images here. They tell me I can hold their interest for about 25 minutes, so I'll try not to go much beyond about 25 minutes, but should still give us lots of time for conversation and discussion. And thanks, of course, to the gentleman who are doing all the AV and the visuals, so thank you for that work. I will be talking about American Muslims and sort of putting it in a slightly different context, and you can see the title around civil rights struggles. Barbara mentioned I'm a U.S. citizen. I became a U.S. citizen in 2013. So when I talk about some of the issues here in America, I don't mean to be negative. I don't mean to be anti-American in any kind of way. I think, like, for all of us who are American, it's the sense of the ideal. You know, what's the ideal of our country, and can we move towards that ideal? And so I start with this image, not about America, but about Canada. The image on the left was done by Haida First Nations artist to commemorate the discovery of the graves of children at residential schools, like 215 children in a residential school near Kamloops, British Columbia. And so, you know, my country, Canada, has its own history, you know, with issues and problems. And then on the bottom, you may recognize our former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau. It's obviously COVID. He's wearing a mask in June of 2021. This was to commemorate the murder of a South Asian Muslim family in London, Ontario, who were killed by an anti-Muslim bigot. You know, basically 5 people were going for a walk, you know, as one could do during COVID. That was your only exercise, and run over by someone who purposely targeted them because the women were wearing hijab. And so, again, all this to say that when we talk about some negative issues, it's not anything unique to the US. Every country, even nice, wonderful places like Canada, have histories and things that we're not so proud of here. And I love this quote because this was at the time, our provost, now our president. So we have this interesting connection at LMU. Tom was asking me about the Jesuit sort of nature of LMU, and it's a great sort of place here. But you know, the president that hired me was our last Jesuit president, Father Bob Lawton. He was replaced by Dave Burcham, another Presbyterian, you know, the dean of our law school. And so we became the first Jesuit school to have a non-Catholic president. Since then, we've had Tim Snyder and now Tom Poon, who was at this point our provost, now is our president. So Tom's our 17th president at LMU. But I love this. You know, this was the beginning of the year in light of the Trump administration sort of crackdown on diversity, equity, inclusion, and the Jesuit University to foster these kinds of questions. And so I framed, so the book is really an introduction to Islam and Muslims, the two religions obviously being, you know, Islam and Christian. Think enough about civil rights. And I've learned from Barbara that many of you were quite involved in that, you know, in that struggle here. So thank you to those of you who actually did this work, you know. I don't know if you've seen this, but there's a great film by Regina King called One Night in Miami. One marvelous, marvelous film based on a real incident where February 25th, 1964, the day after Muhammad Ali shook up the world, beat Sonny Liston in Miami for the World Heavyweight Championship, celebrates, you know, with his friend, and you see the image there, Malcolm X. You know, Malcolm X is the one that brings then Cassius Clay into the Nation of Islam. The film by Regina King is a beautiful film. It's a fictional account. Like, we don't know what they actually said and did, but Ali celebrates, as only Ali could, with Malcolm X, Jim Brown, the great football player, and Sam Cooke, the great R&B singer. So if you haven't seen the film, take a look at the film. It's a marvelous film, but this is an actual shot of that night with the young Muhammad Ali, then Cassius Clay, and Malcolm X in Miami. And I'll say more about Ali, because we often don't think of Muhammad Ali in terms of civil rights, but what he did was extraordinary. That change from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, that change from Christian to Muslim, that moment in 1967 when he refused induction into the Vietnam War as a conscientious objector. And this idea that could a Muslim be a conscientious objector? Where does that fit in? And so really, really interesting. When Ali died in 2016, my students had no sense of this. That's why I love the Ken Burns documentary. If you haven't seen it, the Ken Burns documentary about Ali, basically the first part talks about Ali as a civil rights activist, and that's really this interesting kind of movement. Do we think of this, an American Muslim? But I want to focus on the other person, Malcolm X, because oftentimes we don't think about Malcolm enough. I don't think we think about Dr. King enough. We certainly, I don't think about Malcolm X enough. And I love this quote from him. This was in 1964, of course, in November of 1963. You had the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I mean, we look at the political violence in this country, and what happened yesterday with the assassination of Charlie Kirk, horrific. And people saying this is not America, and outsiders like me say, no, actually, this is America. Like, we have this history here. President Kennedy being shot, his brother Robert Kennedy being shot, Malcolm being shot, Martin Luther King being shot. Like, you have this sort of culture of violence. And so, and many of you probably remember that day in November 1963 when President Kennedy, got shot. And this was Malcolm's reaction to it a couple of months later, wasn't pleased with it, wasn't proud of it, anything like that, but understanding that there's hatred and violence in America. If there's hatred and violence in America, why are we surprised when it visits us? And he used that phrase about the chickens coming home to roost. So that's the bottom part, the context of the thing. But that quote is fascinating to think about. This quote from 1964. Full disclosure, I was born in 1965, so this is before I was born. But you think, and to my students, like I'm older than their parents, and so I'm old. But this moment of, you read this and you think, yeah, that could be true today. Do we talk about this? Do we talk about this idea? Yeah, if you stick a knife in my back and pull it out, that's not progress. Progress is not putting. They haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit that the knife is there. And you think, okay, 60 years later, unfortunately, we still have some of these kinds of issues here. I talked about Dr. King. Some of you may know the work of James Cone, this brilliant African-American theologian, long time at Union Theological Seminary, Black theology of liberation, really one of the key figures in Black theology in the 1960s, 1970s. This is one of my favorite books of his, and this was, you can, actually this isn't the subtitle. This was like, I think, the 20th anniversary edition, Martin, Malcolm, and America. And this idea that, could you have had a Malcolm and civil rights, could you have had a civil rights without Malcolm? We think of Martin King, we think of Dr. King, but do we think about Malcolm X and what he represented? And James Cone, as a young African-American man growing up in New York, talked about the issue here. And I love this, that, I'll let you read that quote here, but this idea for James Cone, that being asked to choose between Malcolm and Martin, violence and nonviolence, Christianity and Islam, to him was an impossible choice. They're both part of me. They're my right and my left hand. How do I choose? How do I do this? And I love that. And he's talking about, again, the 1960s when he's growing up in New York. There was a war going on in Black and white America between Martin and Malcolm. Everyone was forced to choose sides, but I could not. They were like my left and right hands, both necessary for the full expression of my humanity and for my struggle to find my voice in the Black freedom movement. I needed both Martin and Malcolm to defend black humanity under assault by white supremacy in America. I understood why they talked differently about Christianity and blackness, nonviolence and violence, love and hate. You know, I love that. That it's not a either or, either Malcolm or, it's a both and. You need both of them. And that question of, you know, could Dr. King have done what he did without Malcolm there? You know, is that sort of presence in the background there? Fast forward, you know, some 40 years or so, and we look at President Obama, you know, our first and only African-American president, you know, gets elected in 2008. As often is the case when you're president, the next year, you know, after your inauguration, a lot of travel, introducing yourself to the world as the new American president. So this is in June of 2009. He's in Cairo, sort of in the heart of the Middle Eastern world, the Arab world in Egypt. And he gives this speech about Islam in America, and I loved it. Like the book before this book was a book called Muslims and the Making of America, where it really sort of built on this, you know. And I thought, this is brilliant, you know. I remember seeing that speech and thinking, okay, I don't know who's advising President Obama, but whoever did it did a great job, you know, because he talks about the history of Islam in America, you know. Since our founding, American Muslims, the rich United States, fought in our wars, served in our government, stood for civil rights, started businesses, taught at universities, won Nobel Prizes, built our tallest, lit the Olympic torch, you know, won Nobel Prizes. That's literally, we came down California, at Caltech, Ahmed Zewail, you know, who was a chemist at Caltech, Egyptian Muslim, won a Nobel Prize for chemistry, you know, so American Muslims literally right here. Like, you could, I mean, be a long walk, but you could walk down California to Caltech and see, you know, the offices, he passed away now, of an American Muslim Nobel Prize winner. Lit the Olympic torch. That, of course, was Muhammad Ali. We'll come back to him there. And also that moment of when the first Muslim was recently elected to Congress, that was Keith Ellison. Keith Ellison was elected in Minnesota in 2006 and wanted to be sworn in on a Quran because he was the first Muslim elected to Congress. People in this place, America, went crazy. You can't be sworn in on a Quran, you have to be sworn in on a Bible. People like me pointed out, no, you don't have to be sworn in on a Bible because that would be a religious test. And one of the things that makes this country what it is there's no religious test. You don't have to belong to a religion in order to hold office. Some countries you have to belong to a religion in order to hold office. You know, we don't have that in this country. But Keith Ellison did the smartest thing I've ever seen a politician do. Literally walked across the street from Congress to the Library of Congress. Checks out Thomas Jefferson's Quran. I have a picture of this later. Because in 1765, Thomas Jefferson got a copy of the Quran. You know, that's what President Obama is talking about, the sort of the history of Islam that suffuses this thing. Now, before I go too far, yeah, President Jefferson didn't want to be a Muslim, was no great fan of Islam, but when you're about to write something that is kind of important to America, Declaration of Independence, you know, nice to have a comparative perspective, you know. Jefferson knew British law, of course, knew French law. The other law in the 18th century, of course, was the Ottoman Turkish Empire, Islamic law. So he wanted to learn about Islam and Muslims. Very Protestant thing to do. Let me get their text, their scripture. You know, get Sale's translation of the Quran. That's the one that Keith Ellison, 200 years later, is sworn in on. So it's an interesting question. Like, okay, if you can't be sworn in a Quran, what if it's Thomas Jefferson's Quran? Does that make it, you know, a little bit more acceptable to folks? But again, I'll unpack some of these ideas, and this is really what I want to talk about, you know, about the history of Islam and Muslims in America, again, using that lens of civil rights, you know. Taught our universities, excelled in our sports arenas, you know. I had two great Muslim role models when I was a kid growing up in Toronto. You didn't see a lot of people that looked like you didn't see a lot of Asians. The people that I saw that looked different from white folks were black folks, and the only person I saw that was a Muslim was Muhammad Ali. You know, so you have that connection here. But as a basketball fan, it was this guy, you know, prior to LeBron James, the greatest basketball player ever. And you see him on the left as the young Lou Alcindor. Some of you may have gone to UCLA, extraordinary career under the greatest basketball coach ever, the blessed John Wooden, at UCLA. And then converts, becomes Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, develops that sky hook. That's him shooting the signature sky hook that he developed at UCLA over Dan Issel. To give you a sense of the size of the man, Dan Issel, who he's shooting the sky hook over, is 6'10". That's how big Kareem is. And he developed that sky hook when he was at UCLA. Because in 1967, Kareem's freshman year, UCLA banned, or not UCLA, the NCAA banned the dunk. They didn't ban it exclusively because of him, but you think about this, 67, Malcolm's killed in 65, Dr. King would be assassinated in 68, civil rights struggle, black power issues, it had to be upsetting to see large black men, dunking with authority, so they banned the dunk. That's how Kareem developed the skyhook, because they wouldn't let him dunk there. And again, you get the size of the man. We were blessed to have him, this picture first. So this is him as a freshman at UCLA, and I think, okay, I was doing a lot of things when I was a freshman. This was not one of them. This was the famous Cleveland Summit. Muhammad Ali there had refused induction into the Vietnam War. Jim Brown, who was then the star of the Cleveland Browns, called this summit together for black athletes. Say, okay, should we support this guy? If we're going to support this guy, let's hear him out here. And you see on the left, Bill Russell. As much as it pains me to say this as a lifelong Lakers fan, but Russell was astonishing. More championship rings than fingers. When you have 11 championships, that's something that means something. Even though he played for the hated Celtics, you still have to give your respect to Bill Russell, Ali, Jim Brown, and then the young Lou Alcindor, who was a freshman at UCLA, was involved in this. And so you see Kareem, being involved in this kind of thing, civil rights issues, right from his beginnings, literally first year in college. Still doing this. This was from a year ago, where for Juneteenth on CBS, he did this great sort of documentary looking at not so much civil rights, but movements that change America, including, of course, civil rights, the struggle for women's rights, other kinds of things there. But you see him there. Now you've got thousands of Muslim students at UCLA, not so much in the 1960s there. But do we think of Kareem when we think about civil rights? If we think about him, we think about basketball. We don't think about the civil rights part. The same thing with Muhammad Ali. And so I mentioned my other great hero, Ali, and when he was 18 years old, you think about that for a second. Goes to Rome, 1960. Represents America in the Rome Olympics, wins the gold medal, light heavyweight champion in boxing. Comes back to his hometown, Louisville, Kentucky, representing our country, winning a gold medal, unable to eat in the restaurant because, we can serve you at the back, son, but, you can't sit in the dining room and eat, even though you're the Olympic champion, And I think for him, that was that indicator, wait, what's going on here? Something is very wrong. That was 1960. 64, wins the heavyweight championship, beats Sonny Liston. The next day, announces he's no longer Cassius Clay. He's Muhammad Ali. He's no longer a Christian. He's a Muslim. He was reviled for that. Sports writers for years would not call him by his name. They still called him Cassius Clay. If that wasn't bad enough in 64, in 67, refused induction to the Vietnam War. Many of you may remember this. 1967, that was not a popular thing to do. 1972, 73, very different question. But 67, rejecting the war meant you were a communist. Rejecting the war meant you were un-American. And Ali had to deal with it. 1970, the Supreme Court heard his case on a technicality because the lower court didn't tell him why his petition for conscious rejecter status was denied, they reversed that decision. You know, Barbara mentioned this Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam in North America that I'm editing that'll come out next year for Oxford. And the entry that I reserved for myself, editor's privilege, was the entry on Muhammad Ali. And actually, I worked with Dave Burcham. I got Dave to make sure I got the legal stuff right, because the last thing you want is the legal scholars going, no, you didn't get this right. And so for those that don't know Dave, Dave was this brilliant law student, graduated from Loyola Law School, clerked for Justice White, and you know, when you clerk for Supreme Court Justice, you're good. Was dean of our law school before he became president of the university, and so it was, and it's just the kind of person he is. Where like I sent him the draft, said, would you mind looking this over and make sure that I got this right when it comes to the legal case? And he was absolutely, and you know, talked to me for an hour and a half to make sure I got everything right there. But we think about Muhammad Ali and think about, oh yeah, there's some really interesting things here, that when Ali dies, he's probably the most famous man in the world. And what is he? An American Muslim. You know, really, really interesting in those kinds of ways. We'll come back to that in a second. You know, not surprisingly, since I've shown you, two images of African-American Muslims, you know, there's a history here. I was a kid when Alex Haley's Roots came out, and then the original television series with LeVar Burton playing Kunta Kinte, Alex Haley tracing his family's roots, you know, and Kunta Kinte being the ancestor that was brought as a slave, 1730 to Annapolis. But he was a Muslim. And this moment for me, like, wait, there were Muslims who were slaves? Like, how could there be Muslims who were slaves? And you know, well, of course, if we're bringing slaves from West Africa, and Islam has been in West Africa since the 9th century, why are we surprised that some of the slaves that were brought over from West Africa were Muslims? We estimate that about 10% of West African slaves were in fact Muslim. And so there's a history here, like not this book, but the other book begins with a very deliberately provocative sentence. There's never been an America without Muslims. You know, we've had Muslims here since before this country was this country, you know, going back to 1528. 1528, we have a slave, Estevanico the Moor, brought by one of the Spanish conquistadors into Florida, you know, goes up into what is now Texas, dies in what is now Arizona. If you go to Texas, anyone here from Texas, go to Austin, the state capital. There's a monument out front of the State House in Austin, the Texas African American Historical Monument, and there's an image of Estevanico there because he's the first African to come into Texas. And it sort of, I mean, of course, comes in as a slave, but comes in also as a Muslim slave. So there's a history here, you know. We're talking about 9/11. You know, if you go to New York and go to the 9/11 Memorial Museum, I encourage you to do that. You know, go 6 blocks down Duane Street to this place. This is literally 6 blocks away from the 9/11 memorial. I don't know if you can see it, if it's big enough there, but you can see African Burial Ground National Monument. The picture in 1991 sort of gives it away. What you have here in Lower Manhattan on Duane Street, people were doing some renovation, construction. New York is always a site of construction, renovation, and they're digging and they find bones. And of course, you got to stop. Is this a murder scene? Then you find a lot of bones. Oh, this isn't a murder scene. This was a gravesite. You know, and then they realize what it is. It was, of course, an African American gravesite, a burial ground. You know. Declared in 2006 a national monument by President George W. Bush, opened in 2007. So it's a national monument to African slaves who were buried in Lower Manhattan, some of whom were Muslims. We know this because of what they were buried with. You know, the prayer beads, 11 in number, you know, Muslim prayer beads. One case, the Hand of Fatima, this really interesting kind of Islamic symbol. And so we don't know who these people were, but we know that some of them would have been Muslim because of the things literally that they were buried with. And so we look at the fact that, you know, long before 9/11, again, long before America is America, you know, we think of slavery in the South. Slave ships docked in New York. And so you have this really interesting connection there with African slaves, including African Muslim slaves. That's that history. Like, we go back to the slave trade, literally, as I said, to 1528, first documented slave that we know of, long before 1620, long before the Pilgrims, long before the Mayflower, you know, in 1528 there. The woman that's written the most about this is in New York, Sylvain Diouf. She retired from the Schomburg Center. She's actually at Brown University now. Fabulous, fabulous scholar who writes about African Muslim slaves in the early Americas. These are a couple of her books. The most famous is the one on the left, Servants of Allah. It's an image, it's a painting, it's a very famous painting of Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, Job bin Solomon, who's brought as a slave to Annapolis, same place as Kunta Kinte, 1732, gets freed by his owner because he realizes that the slave is literate and literate in lots of languages. His story is actually written about by an Anglican clergyman, Thomas Blewett, in 1734, read in London. If you know your American history, in 1734, General Washington, the father of our country, is in the terrible twos. He's a 2-year-old. Think about that one for a second. That when General Washington is 2, the former General Washington, the one who became General Washington is 2. People in London are reading about an African slave in the Americas. That's what I talk about when I talk about, there's a history here that goes longer than this country. There's a history of Muslims in this country longer than this country here. Some of the other books that she's written there are just fabulous here. We don't have any extant narratives of Muslim women who were slaves, African women who were slaves. We have extant narratives of Muslim men who were slaves, including one in the Library of Congress. This was an interesting film. I teach a religion film class, done by Julie Dash. Julie, at the time, I'll go back here, in 1991, this was the first film in wide release by an African-American female director. And you think about that for a second, 1991. I talked about Regina King's film, One Night in Miami. 30 years later, not a whole lot of African-American women. I mean, more than one, but the fact that Julie was the first, talking about African-American, African slave women in the Carolinas, in the Gullah Territory, Carolina, Georgia, there, re-released in 2016, I think, because a lot of people began to realize that this was this really interesting film. But all this to say that, when we talk about slaves and African slaves, of course there are African women who were slaves, African Muslim women who were slaves. We don't have their stories, directly the way we do of men, but of course they were there. And the film is a fictionalized version of that. So that's a film to look at. Little bit, as I sort of want to wind up things, about American Muslims and the diversity here. I've talked about African American Muslims. About a quarter to a third of American Muslims are African Americans, people who go back for centuries to being American. About a third of us are Middle Eastern. And in this town, Middle Eastern could mean Arab, but it could mean Iranian. Shirin Nishat. Shirin is an Iranian Muslim woman who spent most of her life went to New York to go to school and then lived in LA. LA has a huge Iranian diaspora, hasn't been back to Iran in years, now lives back in New York. Phenomenal artist, one of the great artists in the world. My friend Ed Shad is one of the curators at the Broad Museum of Contemporary Art in LA. And so they did, a couple of years ago now, it was just before COVID actually, so it would have been 2019. The last exhibit I saw before COVID was Ed Shad's curated exhibit of Shirin Nishat, I Will Greet the Sun Again. So if you go onto the website of the Broad Museum, if you like contemporary art, it was the best collection of Shirin's work. And so it's one of those funny moments of, is this what you think of when you think of American Muslims? This woman, Iranian, who's this extraordinary artist here. President Obama talked about, they've built our tallest buildings. This is who he was talking about. A third of American Muslims are African American, about a third are Middle Eastern, about a third are South Asian, people like me from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. Fazlur Rahman Khan, born in Bangladesh, came to America like many of us to go to school, went to the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, got a job as an engineer with Skidmore, Owings Merrill. He was the one that made possible the construction of tall buildings, like the John Hancock building, like the Sears Tower, you know. I think it's the Willis Tower or something now, but I'm old enough that for me it is and always will be, you know, the Sears Tower. So you look at the Chicago skyline, you know, and it was this Muslim that was responsible for it. He didn't build the World Trade Center, but the construction he did as an engineer, you know, allowed for those very tall buildings to be built, you know. And so when President Obama talked about they built our tallest buildings, this is who he was talking about, you know. The interesting sort of thing, you know, with contemporary civil rights struggles, some of you may know the gentleman on the right, Colin Kaepernick, who in 2016, you know, took a knee when he was quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, you know, protesting violence against African Americans, not disrespecting the flag, not disrespecting the country, but literally taking a knee, saying, okay, can we take a knee? Can we take a time out? Can we talk about this issue? And was reviled, you know, for that. The man that he's with is sort of fascinating because the picture, the whole thing is the same picture I showed you, that famous photo of the Cleveland Summit, you know, with Jim Brown and Kareem and Ali. The guy beside him is Mahmoud Abdul Rauf, who in 1996, literally 20 years before, had converted to Islam earlier. Chris Jackson from Mississippi played at LSU, got drafted third in the NBA, went to the Denver Nuggets, became a Muslim, and for one game refused to stand for the national anthem, you know, again, because of what he saw as problems in America in 1986. Reviled for that, basically forced out of the league, you know, and so it's sort of fascinating. Like Colin Kaepernick is not a Muslim, you know, Mahmoud was. And so you think about, okay, when we think about Colin's protest in 2016, do we remember, you know, Mahmoud's protest 20 years earlier as a Muslim around some of the issues here, you know. I'll end here because I know we're coming up on time and I want to give you some time for conversation. This is the funeral for Ali, Muhammad Ali, in 2016. This is Attila Shabazz, which is ambassador, not American ambassador, she was honorary ambassador from Belize, you know, to America. But this was the eldest daughter of Malcolm X, you know, who was, I think, 6 years old and unfortunately present in the Audubon Ballroom, you know, when her father, you know, Malcolm, was assassinated in February of 1965. And she was one of the speakers. I mean, Ali had a state funeral. You know, when you've got presidents in the plural, it's an impressive funeral there. But this is what she said. And it's sort of fascinating because she talks about her dad. And of course, her dad is Malcolm X. You know, and she talks about the legacy of people like her dad, who unfortunately, you know, was killed in 1965, or Ali, who dies in 2016. You know, we must make sure that the principle of men and women, like Muhammad Ali and others, who dedicated their very being to ensure that you get to recognize your own glory, is sustained and passed on like that Olympic torch. You know, Ali lit the torch in '96 in Atlanta, lit the torch again in, I think, 2002 in the Winter Olympics in Salt Lake City, you know, and so it's really interesting. The '96, many people remember that. I mean, that was this fascinating moment of, I think, people finally recognize Ali for Ali, and you know, there he is. If you remember that, really powerful moment. Like I have lots of friends who swim, and you have this great sort of moment where you have this marvelous sort of swimmer, American swimmer, who's the last to hold the torch, and everyone thinks she's going to light the torch, and then literally the curtain opens and it's Ali, and you know, he's holding the thing, and you know, the hand is shaking because of the Parkinson's there, and the gasp and the crowd, oh, it's Ali. You know, this is the kind of thing, and so I love that. I love that, you know, recognition there for him. Two things here, and I will stop. So, you know, the first Trump administration, you know, elected in 2016, first week in 2017, the travel ban, you know, on the Friday, banning people from 7 Muslim-majority countries. What was fascinating, and I literally like flew that morning. My claim to fame is I'm the last human being, or the only human being that's never owned a cell phone. Yeah, my students are amazed at that. Like, but you dressed yourself and came to work. Like, how is this possible? So it's literally, and from you can't make this stuff up with the American Academy of Religion. I was supposed to go to Washington, D.C. on that Friday, January 28th, 27th, this is coming back on the 29th. On the Friday, the 27th of January, I leave. The flight out of LAX is a flight I've taken a dozen times to DC, leaves at 1 o'clock. I leave, the world is normal, land in DC at, like 8 o'clock DC time, go to my hotel, turn on my laptop, and I've got 332 unread emails, since the time I left, and you realize, oh, something's happened. That was at 4:42 that day, was when the first iteration of the travel ban came. I flew back on Sunday, and Joan, for the first time, could not pick me up at LAX because it was too crowded with the protests, So you saw the protests here, and what I loved about it was the Jewish community that stood with the Muslim community, Post October 7th, post the Hamas attacks, there's been a huge rift in the Muslim community and the Jewish community, which some of us are trying to work on and heal. But this was extraordinary, there in LA, here in DC, you had the protests there because, of course, American Jews know where this road leads. So it was this extraordinary moment of American Jews, supporting American Muslims. And I will end here. This was the story I talked about. This was, when the first Muslim, President Obama said, was sworn in on a Quran. This is that ceremony. This is Keith Ellison being sworn in, elected in 2006 in Minnesota, sworn in January of 2007. And what you can see his hand on the 2-volume George Sale translation of the Quran that Thomas Jefferson purchased in 1765. I end not with that picture, though, but with this picture, because after his time in Congress, Keith, American Muslim, came back to Minnesota, got elected as the Minnesota Attorney General. He was the one that prosecuted the police officer who'd murdered George Floyd, And so it's this interesting moment, The reason that the police came on George Floyd was because of the call they got from Cup Foods by a Muslim. So it was a Muslim guy who owned that a convenience store. And his teenage clerk was the one that called because George Floyd had tried to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. And so you got a Muslim that sort of sets off that chain, but you got a Muslim at the end of that chain. Now, did Keith Ellison do the conviction of the police officer that murdered George Floyd because he's an American Muslim? Of course not. He did it because he's a darn good lawyer and knew what charge a jury would actually convict a police officer on, But he also happens to be not just a darn good lawyer, but an American Muslim. And so if we think about this, do we think about, when we think about Black Lives Matter, if we think about Black Lives Matter, if we think about George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd, really interesting connections of American Muslims into that story. And that's really what I've been trying to do here in this book, talk about that story of Muslims and Christians being neighbors to each other. So let me stop there. And I think I went on a little longer than I thought I would, so my apologies for that. But I think, Barbara, we still have some time for questions, discussion. I'm not sure how one does this here. Oh, yeah, I think they've got a microphone.
Norm. I am active in a congregation here in Pasadena for which meaningful relationships with persons of other faiths is in our DNA. Christmas Eve services, very widely attended, include readings by a Jewish rabbi from the Hebrew Scriptures, by a Muslim leader from the Quran about Jesus' birth, and of course from the Christian side as well. My question for you is, your book, One God, Two Religions, did you consider the title One God, Three Religions, and why did you not go that way?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. The reason I did that, and absolutely, I think, to be fair, I think there should be a couple of books there. I'm not trying to create more work for myself. I think one thing, how are Muslims and Jews similar to, different from each other? In many ways, as a Muslim, I find much more similarity with the Jewish tradition than I do with the Christian tradition, not the least of which is things like diet, never have to ask, was there ham in this, is there pork in the, those sorts of things there. Muslims and Jews have a very similar notion of God that's very different from the Trinitarian notion that Christians do. This book, though, was really meant to introduce Islam to a North American audience, which, just in terms of numbers, is a Christian audience. But absolutely, I think, what I should do is a book about, Muslims and Jews, this book about Muslims and Christians. There's already lots of great books about Christians and Jews, so I don't need to write that book, but absolutely making those connections. So there is a little bit in the book, and I talk about my connections, as a good Muslim boy. My rabbi is Sharon Brous at Ikar, and I'm talking about Sharon in this book as I was going to say as close to, but it's not close to. She is a prophetic voice, and I use that in a literal sense, like a God's prophet sort of speaking there. My previous book, Muslims Making America, actually started with her Rosh Hashanah sermon in 2016 there. But thank you for that. Yeah, absolutely. Like those connections between Muslims and Jews, Christians and Jews, Muslims, Christians and Jews is so important. But for me, it just in terms of the simplified part, I think it's easier dealing with the two than with the three. One last thing, and I'll stop here, that in some ways the three actually, though, becomes really important because one of my great teachers in comparative theology is a Jesuit. I teach at LMU, Jesuit school. I'm required to mention at least one Jesuit by name anytime that I speak there, so I just want to make sure for the record that I've mentioned a Jesuit, and this is Father Frank Clooney. Frank Clooney was at Boston College, then went on to a little school called Harvard, to direct their Center for the Study of World Religion. So Frank is this marvelous scholar of comparative religion, actually works on Hinduism. But Frank always insists, when he does comparative work in his classes, of doing three traditions. Because if you do two, it's very simple to go to the either or. It's this or it's that. And the minute you introduce a third, it's like, oh yeah, it's not a simple binary. It's not just this or just that. Here's now a third. So Frank always does three. So Frank called me on this, as well, to say, okay, bring in a third tradition here. But thank you.
Somebody else.
There's a question over here.
This actually is a theological question. I'm really drawn to Sufism. And I hear conflicting reports that the other day I was just reading that Muslims, a real Muslim does not acknowledge Sufism at all. And I actually visited Konya?
Oh, Konya in Turkey, Rumi's shrine?
Yeah. And those Muslims there really believe, and so I'm just curious.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's a great question. So, and there is a shameless plug for the book. There's a chapter in the book specifically about Sufism and talking about this. But the short answer to your question is no, absolutely. I think for Muslims, so Sufism is the mystical tradition within Islam, just like you have Christians who have a more mystical take, for that matter, Jews, more mystical take, a direct experience with the divine, having that kind of thing. You have that, and it's very rich in the Islamic world. The great medieval Muslim thinkers, so if you think about, the Middle Ages, Aquinas is the great sort of Catholic thinker, Maimonides is the great sort of Jewish medieval rabbi, a man named Al-Ghazali is the great Muslim thinker. To this day, like he dies in 1111, so easy date to remember there. But like 900 years later, you still study his work. So Ghazali is like an Aquinas, for Christians. If you're studying any sort of Sunni theology anywhere in the Muslim world, his magnum opus is a book called Ihya al-Ulumuddin, literally like revival, like the bringing back to life of the religious sciences. Ghazali is the one that reconciles Sufism with Islam and says, yeah, there's no problem being a good Muslim and being a Sufi, because the whole idea is that mystical tradition shouldn't take you beyond that. I mean, there are people, Muslims, back to your question, Muslims very much like Jews have certain sort of practices. You shouldn't do this, you should do that, eating certain foods, not drinking, that kind of thing. The Sufis often in that ecstatic vision, talking about drunkenness and sometimes a literal drunkenness. So that was the kind of thing, like, is this sort of an excess? Like, if you have this union with God, can you then, is the law no longer valid upon you and you have to do this? Ghazali's like, no, that's ridiculous. You can be a Sufi, you can be a mystic and be a very good Muslim. Unfortunately, there are parts of the Muslim world, like Saudi Arabia, which really cracks down on this, but the rest of the Muslim world, you mentioned Konya, Rumi, perhaps the most famous Sufi with the Mevlevi order, the whirling dervishes. There's Coleman Barks, I think was responsible more than anyone else for Rumi being like the best-selling poet in America at the beginning of the 20th century with his translations of this. And yet, like, they're deeply, back to your question, they're deeply rooted in the world of Islam. And the one thing I don't like about Coleman's translations, and I love Bill Chittick. So Bill is this extraordinary scholar in New York, teaches at SUNY State University of New York at Stony Brook, is retired now. But I love his translations of Rumi because he just gives you the notes that, oh, when Rumi is saying this, this is actually a line from the Quran. When Rumi is saying this, this is actually a hadith, a saying of the Prophet, that it's so deeply ingrained within the Islamic tradition that you sort of can't pull it out. But yeah, that's the short answer. The longer answer is the chapter in the book that talks about Sufis and their relationship to God and how I think for so many of us that speaks to us.
Libby, and we've had a request that you repeat the question
sure.
or comment
Right, because they can't
for
hear.
the video.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Or speak loudly. This is sort of a sweeping question, so you might not be able to answer it very very well. But I'm not talking about Ali or Malcolm X or Kareem, so forth. But you're sort of house and garden variety Muslim. Take the 50s, something like
Right.
that. This sounds weird, but how out could they be?
Yeah. So it's a great question there. So the question is about, not the sort of famous folks I've been talking about, like Muhammad Ali or Malcolm X, but the average garden variety, like how out could they be as a Muslim? I think that it's a question that's relevant today, too. Like a lot of my friends will say to me, or a lot of people that know me will say, I'd like to do some dialogue, go and talk to some Muslims, but there's no mosque in my town. And my first answer is, well, is there a hospital in your town? Because you're probably going to find some Muslim doctors there. Is there a university in your town? You're probably going to find some Muslim professors there, mostly in the engineering department. For some reason, we're drawn to engineering there. But I think that's the answer to your question, is that for so many American Muslims, like I've had friends that say, I'd like to do dialogue with Muslims, but I don't know any Muslims. I'm like, yeah, someone that's a Muslim. You just don't know that they're Muslim. It's not funny, but it's funny. It's the same analogy with the LGBTQ community, where people say, yeah, I don't know anyone gay. I'm like, oh yeah, you know someone that's gay. You just don't know that they're gay. In that kind of way. And so, like, your cardiologist isn't there to proclaim Islam and talk about Islam. He's there to help you. She's there to help you with your heart. The nurse isn't there to talk about Islam. And so, for a lot of American Muslims, there isn't a lot of the proselytizing kind of thing. Now, when I say that, I don't mean just the knocking on doors trying to convert you. I just mean sort of being a Muslim. Part of it is that, you've seen this huge increase in the American Muslim population, mostly due to immigration. And so the majority of American Muslims are people like me. By that, I don't mean people from South Asia, even though that's the case. It's people who've come here since 1965. With civil rights law, you had changes to immigration law. Yes, you had African slaves who were brought over as Muslims, but they, of course, couldn't practice their religion. Many of them had to convert. The religious tradition sort of, I don't want to say dies out, but has to go underground. Then you've got people coming in the 18th, 19th century from the Ottoman Empire. I just reviewed a book by a guy, and it's one of those funny moments. It's the guy who created Brooklyn Brewery out of New York, who happens to, be sort of a secular Muslim, but his grandfather, a guy named Ali Hindi, came in the 19th century, sort of a peddler, and he was involved in all these kinds of things, but people didn't know him as a Muslim. They knew him as an Arab. They knew him as the sort of vendor who did these kinds of things. And so, back then, you may not have seen Islamic places, even though The first mosque in this country that was built as a mosque was built in Maine in 1915. Then you had a mosque built in Brooklyn in 1918, Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1926, Ross, North Dakota in the 1930s. And again, that was like Cedar Rapids, Iowa, Ross, North Dakota. Well, yeah, you had people coming from what was the Ottoman Turkish Empire, coming into the Midwest, coming to farm and do that kind of work there. So in the 50s and 60s, you know, you might not have encountered a lot of Muslims there because there weren't a lot of us there. Most of us came after 65, again, with the changes to immigration law. And so, you know, you would have seen like the mosque in Washington, D.C., that was the first mosque that was built after World War II. You know, now there's a bunch of mosques in D.C., but, you know, in the 1950s, there would have been that one mosque. Same thing, like when we came to Canada in 1970, Toronto was like a British, it wasn't a white city, it was a British city. You know, the Italian Catholic was the exotic other, forget about the South Asian Muslim. Toronto in 1970 had one mosque. When I left in 1997, I think there were 35 mosques in the city. And so you see that growth. It's nowhere close to, you know, you hear these you know, outlandish things, American Muslims are gonna take over America, or the number of Muslims is growing. And no, that's just not a thing. Like, you know, at most there are 7 million Muslims in America. That's not a huge number out of the, you know, 400 million or so Americans there. You know, it's a huge increase, you know, over the last 50 years, basically. But it's not, you know, order of magnitude increase there.
Someone else, Dave, and then Tom.
The Sunni and the Shia, are there any special differences between them in the United States?
Yeah, great. So the question there is Sunni and Shia Muslims, are there differences, especially in the United States? So the short answer is no, that Sunnis and Shias are not like Catholics and Protestants. They're more like variants of the Protestant tradition. And so I don't mean to put my wife Joan on the spot, and I probably hear from her when on the drive back, but I'll do it anyway because I think it's funny. Here, I mentioned Jeff Syker, you know, who was our department chair that hired me, Presbyterian minister, and he was at the church just outside LMU there. And so Joan and I once went to the service that Jeff was presiding over, and Joan's a Methodist. And we came out of that service, and I thought, well, that was interesting. And Joan was like, yeah, it was completely different than what I have experienced. I'm like, how was it completely different? It looked exactly like the Methodist service that I've gone to with you. She's like, well, no, like when you did the confession, like they actually said it out loud. Like we say it silently. I'm like, oh, that's a huge difference, you know, saying it out loud or saying it silently to yourself. Oh, I get it. That's, you know. So it's the Sunni Shia split is more like that, you know, kind of thing. There are practices that I happen to be a Sunni Muslim. About 85% of the world's Muslims are Sunni Muslims. 15% are Shia Muslims. Sunni, those who follow the traditions of the Prophet. That's what Sunnah means. Shia, the partisans of Ali. For the Shia community, it's really let me start that again. It's really a theological issue, you know. When the Prophet Muhammad dies in the year 632, he's a religious figure. He's also a political figure. He's got like tens of thousands of people, you know. The history of Christianity is very different from the history of Islam, mostly on timescales. You know, when Jesus dies, he's not a political figure. It's not till the 4th century that Christianity is a political, you know, empire reality with the Armenian kingdom, the Ethiopian kingdom, Roman Empire adopting Christianity. That happens in the lifetime of the Prophet. So when Muhammad dies, he's literally the head of tens of thousands of people. Who is going to replace him? So that's the political aspect, but it's a theological issue. You know, does leadership come from the family of the Prophet? Muhammad, unlike Jesus, is married, has children, has grandchildren, you know, and so there's literally like a family. Is authority vested sort of in the family of the Prophet, or is it anyone? The majority community, the Sunni community, says no. It's the best qualified person. It's not someone within the family. The minority community says, no, it's Muhammad's cousin, son-in-law, who marries Muhammad's eldest daughter. Muhammad has 4 daughters. 3 of them died before he does. His daughter Fatima marries a man named Ali. For the Shia community, Ali, who grows up in the household of the Prophet, really should be the person. It's not about any kind of monarchy thing because you're the son of the monarch. It's because you've grown up in the house of the Prophet. In the pre-modern world, you know, you learn the trade that your family does. You know, if your family's bakers, that's what you're going to be. You know, if your family's farmers, that's what you're going to be. Who better than someone from Muhammad's family to understand this tradition? So that's where it comes from. The practices are just slightly different. And so for all Muslims, you're supposed to pray 5 times a day. You know, for all Muslims, if you're traveling, you can combine the evening prayer and the night prayer. The Shia community says, well, if you can do it when you're traveling, why not do it, you know, all the time, you know? And you can combine the noon and the afternoon prayers. So it looks like folks in the Shia community may be praying 3 times a day and not 5 times a day. They're actually praying the same 5 prayers. They're just combining, they pray the dawn prayer, then they combine the noon and the afternoon prayer, and they combine the evening and the sunset prayers. So that's the kind of example. They're doing the same kind of thing. The way you hold your hands, you know. For most Sunnis, when you pray, your hands are like this. For most Shia, when you pray, your hands are like this. So it's, you know, is it a big difference? No, but it's certainly an observable kind of difference. The fasting, you know, for all Muslims, you're to fast in the month of fasting, the 9th month of the Muslim calendar. You break the fast as a Sunni at sunset, you know. For the Shia, you have to wait till it's dark. And you know, just from here, the difference. You know, sunset is going to be, actually, sorry, this watch tells me when sunset is, because it's a, you know, thing. So 7:05 will be sunset. But it won't get dark till about 7:20, 7:30, you know. And so for the Sunni, it's like, no, you 7:05, you break the fast at 7:05. For the Shia, it's no, you have to wait till it's dark. And so so when I'm talking about the differences, it's those kinds of differences, not, you know, unmarried celibate men or priests versus, you know, the Protestant notion of the priesthood of all believers. So it's not like Catholics and Protestants. It's much more like, you know, Methodists and Presbyterians, Methodists and Congregationalists, Presbyterians and, you know, Lutherans, you know, that sort of thing. I'm not saying there aren't distinctive differences between Presbyterians and Lutherans. I understand that. What I'm saying is that, you know, not as huge as the difference between Presbyterians and Catholics.
I thought that there was some hostility between
Yeah.
Shias and Sunnis.
No, and that's a great question. And there has been historically that hostility. The question was hostility between Sunnis and Shias. One of the leaders of the Shia tradition is martyred, killed by Sunnis, and that's seen as like this sense of, you know, here's the righteous leader who goes up against the sort of evil empire, and this is what, you know, the empire does to the righteous. So you have that happening. What's happened in the contemporary world isn't that, but the kind of things, you know, post 9/11, you had the war in Iraq, you had the civil war basically in Syria. So you've seen like Sunni and Shia persecutions. There was a great moment in 2003, you know, when you had the Iraq war and you started seeing violence among Sunnis and Shias in Iraq with the sort of great Southern California Muslim leader at the time was Maher Atout, who founded the Islamic Center of Southern California, Egyptian Muslim guy. The great sort of Shia leader in Southern California is Imam Qazwini, who's at the mosque by the John Wayne Airport in Orange County there, and he's Iraqi. And the two of them did some really good work saying, look, here I am, an Egyptian Sunni, here I am, an Iraqi Shia. We live in America. There's nothing in the tradition that says we should kill each other. So going back to the Catholic-Protestant thing, there's nothing in the tradition that says Catholics and Protestants should fight each other. Unfortunately, there's been that history at times where you have had that kind of sectarian violence between them.
You know, I'm the last one. I'm sorry about that. At the risk of being overly simplistic,
Sure.
In let's say American Christianity, at least as I experience it, there's a significant shift going on, and that shift is a part of the chaos, I think. But from a religion focused on how to get to heaven,
Right.
and emerging a religion that cares a great deal about the earth. And never the twain shall meet, apparently. So this is kind of recasting the foundations of at least my sense of Christianity in America. How is this, getting to heaven as the priority versus loving the earth? How is that showing up for you in the world of Islam?
Yeah, great question there. And again, shameless plug. Sorry, yeah. Great question. There's a shameless plug for that in the book. So the question is about, if you look at the changing paradigms within Christianity, the traditional paradigm about heaven and your relationship to heaven, and the emerging paradigm, how do we live on this earth, creation, that kind of thing. And so we talk about it literally as, traditional paradigms, emerging paradigms. That's one of the chapters in the book, talking about exactly that with respect to Islam and Muslims. So traditionally for Muslims, that same sense of, how do you live a good life? What do you do? The end goal being like God's pleasure, that sort of thing. But of course, they're not mutually incompatible with each other. Now, a couple of things there, like, only about half the Muslims in this country identify with the mosque, go to a mosque. Sometimes it's because they find them sort of too conservative. I know we have to wrap up because folks have to go, so let me try to make this as short as possible. But, if we look at LA, largest religious community in Los Angeles is Catholics, no surprise. Second largest religious community in Los Angeles, non-practicing Catholics. That's how big the Catholic community is. So just like you've got Muslims, just like you've got Christians that go to church regularly every Sunday, Christians go to church regularly every Easter and Christmas. Christians go to church regularly, when they're baptized and perhaps when they die. Same thing for Muslims. But your question about the environment is really important. And you have Muslims, like with that, back to the first question about Jews, if you're going to keep halal, how do you do it? Do you not do it in a good way? Can you have factory farming and still call it halal? Does it have to be done in the right kind of way? What's your relationship to the earth? How do you live on the earth? And so the word, and so it's a play on words, the word for religion in Arabic is deen, D-E-E-N. The color associated with the Prophet Muhammad is green. And so for a lot of Muslim countries, you'll see like green on the flag because green is a color that's sort of associated with the Prophet. And the literal movement, to answer your question, is called green your deen, like green your religion. Exactly the same kind of thing. Like, how do I live in the earth? How am I called to live in the earth? And Muslims use exactly the same kinds of arguments that Christians do around what is the role of humanity. As human beings, are we part of God's creation? Are we the best of God's creation? Are we in charge of God's creation? Are we stewards of God's creation? Muslims are called to be representatives of God on earth, to steward this. Which means, like, if you're the steward, if you're like, you're house sitting for someone, doesn't mean you have the wild party when the person comes back and goes, what the hell did you do to what did you do to my house? That's the thing, that's the religious thing. Like, if God has given us this land, we gotta give it back, like in the right kind of way. And the Quran is explicit in talking about plants and animals as being part of God's order, and the responsibility and the relationship, not just of humans, but of humans to the natural world, meaning both of the plant world and the animal world. And so I think for a lot of Muslims, there is exactly that same sense of things. How do we exist in this world? And I use that language of traditional paradigm and emerging paradigm within Christianity precisely to talk about what's happening here. So, and I'm sorry that for those that are having to stick around a little bit later because this has gone on longer, but thank you for that.
Good. Let's thank Amir, please. Next week, Helen Batts is hosting, and we have someone from Pasadena Library coming. Don't have a name, but she will talk about how it's a resource to us in our third act. And reminder, and it's in the minders. Yeah, for sure. Okay, great. Thanks. Okay. Hymnals away. Please.